And it's understandable. If you are a 10-year-old and you are on a screen all the time and you are getting all of this information from every place, you have a difficult time knowing what is accurate, what isn't. I'm intrigued by the worldwide movement of news literacy training. And I'll just, this is unscientific, but just stick with me on this. When you look at literacy rates around the world, it's the Nordic countries that are always up at the top, all right? When you look at things like the World Press Freedom Index, are you all familiar with that? World Press Freedom Index is, I think, generally regarded as one of the best indicators. By the way, Americans think we're number 1 or 2. We're 43rd now out of 190. It's a terrible, shameful thing. But anyhow, the Nordic countries are right up there. So a couple of years ago, I was at a thing on World Press Freedom Day, and a woman who was the ambassador to, I think it was Denmark, was there, and they were number 1 that year. And someone asked her, why do you think you're number 1 consistently? She immediately focused on news literacy. And one of the things she said was, in our secondary school education, news literacy is a requirement. It is part of our core curriculum. So it's hard to get school systems in America to do that. But one of the things we are focused on is, could we somehow do that in our schools? The question is, how do you start it? I think you start with either parents or you start with teachers. Maybe you give them an incentive to go to a training course on this. We might pay for that. I think I could raise money for that, $5,000 to somebody to go through the training and then come back and be, you know, an advocate for it.
Can we hold you up for that?
I'm sorry?
May we hold you up to that?
Yes. Yeah. We are thinking about starting a separate newsletter, free, that deals only with schools. We are thinking about things like, we know that students, that young people are really focused on the environment. I mean, Bill, I'd be interested in your comments on this because you're around students all the time. But when I was doing some teaching here, I was constantly amazed when I would talk to students about their futures. How many of them said they didn't want to bring children into the world because what's happening to the environment? Wow, that really shocked me. But
anxiety and depression among our young people, high school, college students. The pandemic exacerbated it, but it was pre-existing before the pandemic. And they are mostly concerned about growing up and living their lives in a world that's being destroyed environmentally by the older generations. There's a great deal of resentment toward older generations for screwing up the planet.
Yes, us, yeah. So, you know, yeah.
I'm finding that my reading of American news coverage is that that particular issue happens to be highly politicized, polarized, and bipartisan. That if you happen to be a Republican, you've got a particular view on that. You've got these old conservative views that God will look after our planet, therefore we can do what we please. And then you have your liberals and the Democrats who think differently. Would that influence the thinking of young people at school today? I mean, can you categorize them also as Republicans or Democrats? Are they also, you know, bifurcated in that particular way?
That's a great question. I'll take a stab at it. I don't have kids and I don't teach, so take this with a grain of salt. I think it would be difficult to extrapolate and say a young person thinks like a Republican or a Democrat, but I do think they think like their parents. And I have found a shift even from the time I was ombudsman at the Post. At that time, there was a huge debate about whether climate change was real. Even in the 2 years I was there in my term, I saw that shifting to an acceptance that no, that climate change is real, but the debate is over the causes or remedies. And that's where I think it gets much more complicated. But I think, Bill, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. I mean, I think this is a pretty environmentally conscious area, but it's very conservative around here.
Athens City is left of center. So Athens is kind of like a little pocket of blue surrounded by deep, deep red. There's a lot of resentment in the outside of the city of Athens toward the city of Athens. The environmental issue is grotesquely politicized. The fossil fuel industry basically is the Republican Party is a wholly owned subsidiary of the fossil fuel industry in a lot of ways. And so they've been fighting against climate protection since the 1980s, really. And then when it became, undeniable that the climate is changing because of human activity, industrial activity, I actually heard some Republican lawmakers say, well, won't it be good to have better growing seasons in the northern part of the country, and saving on heating costs and things like that. I mean, trying to rationalize it. And it's still a big issue now. So we just had a new law it's going to be passed here in Ohio that's going to restrict what we can talk about in the classroom at public universities. And climate change is one of the specific issues they wrote into that if we talk about climate change, we have to provide both sides of the story in the classroom. So, my plan is to say, well, most scientists agree that the human activity has changed it. And then there's a few crazy people who deny that. There, I've talked about both sides, but I mean, it's just ridiculously politicized. And it motivates voters. So among the young people, only about 50% of American people go to college, not all finish. Those who don't go to college tend to be very resentful of the college educated. And so being anti-environmental is actually a badge of honor for many people who don't go to college. You've seen all the big pickup trucks running around. These are very popular vehicles for people who are just like, I drive one, but I drive one because I have a farm. But you have these people who have these grotesquely large vehicles because they're like, I am in the business of wasting fuel. That is what I want to do. When they drive diesel trucks, some of them will even modify it so that they're not efficient, so that they actually put out plumes of smoke. And when they hit the accelerator, it is a cloud of impenetrable dark smoke. It's a fashion thing. It's called rolling coal. And they do it, especially if there's like a hybrid car or an electric car behind them. They call it Prius repellent. So it's basically a public antagonism toward people who are trying to be fuel conscious.
Wow. Sorry, I'm interested in another issue that is potentially highly politicized, and that is gender ideology. At schools and in the media, how does that feature here locally? I mean, we've got a particular situation in South Africa.
Again, Athens is very accommodating in that regard. I mean, Athens, a lot of restaurants in Athens have removed gender labels from bathrooms. A bathroom is a bathroom. If it's occupied, lock the door. If it's not, it's basically, I grew up in a house. My mom and my sister, my dad and I, we shared the same bathroom. We had no problem with that. Everybody takes your turn. But then you have outside of Athens Center, you have school districts that have passed policies saying only your birth sex, you can only use the bathroom aligned with the sex of you on your birth certificate. And they're like adamant about, men and women bathrooms only, highly segregated. And many states have passed what they call bathroom bills that prohibit local jurisdictions. Like Athens, if a bathroom bill were to be passed in Ohio, Athens would be prohibited from having genderless bathrooms. So again, it's very, very politicized. All of this is to basically get the base agitated so that they'll turn out to vote. There are many people who support these measures who don't agree with them and think they're nonsense, but they know that it works with voters. So it's crass partisanship. It's not just ideological differences. It boils down to just what do we need to do to win elections?
So that is a great topic to raise, and it's something we're dealing right now with our little nonprofit. One of the ways we engage with the community is that with young people is we created an annual storytelling contest. And this is kind of funny. It started as an essay contest, and our board members gave money. So I think the first year we had a prize pot of maybe $1,000, and you would submit as a student, you would submit an essay, and then we had members of the community, including some journalists, that would judge them and give them awards. All right. So a couple of years ago, we were going to do this again, and we invited in the editor of the paper, who is a graduate, Ben Peters. And you will appreciate this because you know Ben. This guy, I love this guy. He's got a little bit of an edge, you know, and he's not afraid to tell you what he thinks. So we had like 8 or 9 adults there, and we're talking about the essay contest and how will we do it this time. And at some point, someone said to Ben, how do you think we would get more students involved? And Ben said, well, I'll tell you. He said, you know, I'm just a few years out of high school, but if one of you came to my high school when I was in high school and said, hey, there's this really cool thing, it's an essay contest, he said, I would think I have absolutely no interest in entering that. And so the question was, well, what would you do? He said, you're not focusing on how young people communicate. They communicate on TikTok. For them, that is storytelling. It's Instagram and all that. So we completely changed it, all right? And as a result, I went back to my board. As you gather, I'm really good at getting people to give money. We increased the prize pot to 2,000. We got 50 entries and it was a roaring success. Now, the reason I'm telling you this, one of those winning entries was a woman who basically did a video story about her coming out as gay. She is, how old now? I think 14 or 15 years old now. It was beautiful. It was so honest and unpolished in many ways, but genuine, thoughtful and everything. So as a result of that, after she won this award, we have a ceremony, the parents come. I mean, it's actually quite emotional for parents. When your child gets an award, it's a big deal, you know. We were talking to her about this and she said, you know, I would like to write about this. And so we have in the works a story that is going to be tough. She wants to write about what it's like to come out as a high school student in this rural community. And the delicacy of it is that we want her to do the story, but we have to educate her that you can't just talk about your friend who came out. You have to interview them. Then we have questions. Can you name that person? Has that person told their parents that they're out? All these huge ethical issues that we have to be sensitive to. But in the discussion with her, we were asking, what do you think will be the reaction if we get this piece that's published? And she said, among my friends, no one will care. It's not a big deal for us, but our parents, it's a big deal. And I think that is true. I mean, based on the young people I know, it's a generational thing. Coming out today is just, for young people, so what, you know? But the parents, you know, it's a big deal, and we have to be sensitive to how. So that's going to be a very interesting thing to see how that plays out. But anyhow, just to close off the creativity part of this, we're thinking of all sorts of things to do with young people. One of the things on the environment is we're wondering, could we have students every week produce a little question about the environment that actually has a student's name on it? And then maybe you go to a separate page in the paper and there's the answer. I think you could do that without politicizing it, but it would be a way of getting students to see that there's value in having quality information. This is the fun part of doing this. You know, it's, again, you're limited only by your creativity and how much energy you want to bring to it. So I will stop there. Who has questions before you want to take a break before we get into?
Quick break.
Yeah.
We'll reconvene shortly, and then we'll have lunch. Then after lunch, talk more about strategies for gauging public opinion in your community.
Good, good. Yeah, let's take a break.
So let's take a 15-minute break. Yeah. Let's try to keep it 2:50.
Can you hear me now? Everything's okay? All right. Okay, welcome back. All right, so you've had your fill of Foothills Forum. Tiny little thing. There may be some ideas there that you can gather. So Bill wanted me to talk about one aspect of something we did in starting Foothills Forum, which I really had very little to do with, but I have to say it was really important in us establishing ourselves. I mentioned these ginger groups that created the concept of Foothills Forum. One of the early ideas, or one of the early questions posed by the Ginger group is, okay, well, if we start this Foothills Forum thing and we're doing journalism that's going to appear in the local paper and other places, how do we know what to cover? How do we know what the community really cares about? And I have found, being in newsrooms my entire life, that one of the really stupid things we do as journalists is we assume we know what our audiences want. And I mean, we were just talking about underserved communities. You know, we, in most of my experience, we did a terrible job of serving underserved communities, but we know in America that is a growth in our community or our country. It's an incredibly important thing. So how do you find out what different people think about? And early on, somebody came up with the idea, let's do a survey. All right, seems pretty simple thing. As I mentioned earlier, there are good surveys and bad surveys. How many times do you read stories that come across a newswire about a survey of something, and when you dig into it, you realize it's total baloney, that the sample size was small, that the questions were poorly posed. So one of the things you learn when you get into survey research is it's damn complicated, and it has to be very, very precise. And fortunately, we had people in our little Ginger groups that instantly said, well, you can't just like put out a questionnaire to people and have them write in answers. You have to put a lot of thought into this. So this is how we did it. And it took a long time. First of all, we created a survey committee. One of the advantages that we had in our community is we have a lot of former government workers that have come out to this rural area to live, and a certain percentage of them have been involved in surveys. So we had a woman who was the head of survey research for the Department of Labor. That's a big federal agency. She really knew her business. We had two people that worked for a company called Mathematica, which does a lot of survey research stuff. And early on, we got this survey committee together, and they basically said, again, you have to put in a lot of time thinking about this. So they did a smart thing. They knew they needed help. And 40 miles away from my house in the town of Charlottesville, Virginia, is a very large university, the University of Virginia. And at that university, like many universities, they have a survey research arm, and in their case is particularly noted for rural research. Much more difficult than in urban areas, because think about it, in a community like ours, it has limited cell service. Broadband is not easy. People are living scattered in hollows and all that. So we started working with them, and the survey committee came up with a questionnaire, which they called a pretest. And then once we came up with a basic idea of a questionnaire that would be part of a survey, we convened several focus groups and actually hired professional focus group administrators to come in and say, okay, these are the questions we're thinking of asking on a survey. What do you think of them? And again, I was not part of this, but I am told that basically the focus group said these are imprecise. They're not getting at information that we would be able to actually respond to and all that. So that it caused us to rewrite the survey questions, you know, probably 60 to 70% of what we had. Think of what we had, if we had not done that, how imprecise this would have been going to the community. So that was a step, all right? Key decisions to be made. We had an advantage in our community. The community is 96% white. I don't happen to think that's a great community to live in, but it does help from a survey standpoint, because you do not have to worry about translations, reaching underserved communities that may speak different languages or whatever. That made it easy. But you do have obstacles. Cell service, as I mentioned, is spotty at best in parts of the county. So you can't do telephone surveys. And we've quickly determined that it would have to be done by mail. That you would have to do that. So then you face the question of who are the households, all right? Not so easy. Do you send it to every household? Do you try to do it on a random scientifically selected group of people? That's difficult when you have people, a high percentage of your community, they're what we call weekenders. They're people that live in the city, they come out there. So all these questions had to be determined. And so we came up with a list of 3,800 addresses in the community. A little bit complicated because some of those are duplicates. It might be an address of where your house is, but you may not get your mail there. You may get your mail at a post office box at the post office. So how did we accommodate that? The end result was it was decided that three things. We would do this in a process. We're going to try and do it with every household in the county. That's a lot, right? As I mentioned, it's about 3,500 households. The way we sort of got people prepared for this was we sent them a postcard initially saying, you're going to get a survey soon. And here's what it's about. It's anonymous. It's being sponsored by this group with the newspaper. We then advertised in the paper, in addition to the post office, and put ads in the paper that we paid for saying, we're going to do this survey. Expect to get a survey soon. A couple weeks later, we actually sent the surveys out. We did a smart thing based on what we were told. We personalized every single survey cover letter, dear Mr. Jones, dear Mrs. Brown, or whatever like that. It was a way of basically saying, this is anonymous, but we're sending it to you and we want your help on this. We assured that the questionnaire was confidential. However, they were coded in a way that we could tell what part of the county they went to. And we explained that to people. Again, transparency. We're not using your name. We just want to be able to analyze where this came from in the county. Part of the reason for that was when we started to get the responses, we wanted to know, was there an area of the county that we just didn't get responses from? Why was that? All right. So we did that, and then we waited for the responses to come in. And it was not an initial robust response, but then after a few weeks, when we knew who had not responded, we sent the survey again to those people with another letter saying, hey, in case you missed it, here's why we're doing this, and all that. So we also, in the end, and this is a significant thing because we went through all these, these initial steps, we had a total response rate of 42%. That is unbelievably high, unbelievably high. And it was high enough that we were able to then say, based if we had done this randomly statistically, that the accuracy rate on responses would be plus or minus 3%. So that was good. All right. Now, what did we learn from this? All right. Here's what we suspected going into the questionnaire. We suspected that clearly the top issue that people would have would be our taxes. We're paying too much in taxes. Taxes are too high. They're inequitable. All right. That was the first thing we assumed. We secondly assumed that a big issue would be environmental quality. We don't want developers here. We don't want apartment buildings. We don't want fast food restaurants. We don't want a stoplight, that it would be environmentally pure. And then what we found out and what surprised us was the taxes were actually fairly far down on the list. All right. We found out that environmental quality was a big issue, but in ways that we did not initially interpret, which I'll get into in a second. What was the biggest issue in the county? A lack of adequate broadband and cell service. By far. Now, we knew that that was going to be an issue. We had no idea that it would be So clearly the top issue. A second one that sort of surprised us, we knew that housing was expensive there. Affordable housing was probably second in importance. So what did this tell us then, and the value of this? It told us that as we started our journalism, this is what we need to focus on. So one of the first things we did with Foothills Forum journalistically was we hired a reporter who really knew a lot about broadband and cell service. And we did this massive 3-part series on the lack of cell service and broadband in our county, what it means. You know, it's not just the convenience of it, but we had anecdotes in there of people, in one case, a guy who bled to death because he had a farm accident, but he couldn't get a cell service, couldn't even call the EMS people. We had lots of cases where the volunteer fire department saying there was a fire, we got the message late because somebody ran down the road and told us because they couldn't get. So these had really practical impacts in the reporting we did. We went to other counties in our state that were facing the same problem and said, well, how are you dealing with it? What we found was that years earlier, they had set up task forces to start dealing with this problem. You know, you think about this, that cell service, particularly in broadband, it's so much a part of our lives, but when you do not have that, you are disadvantaging young people who can't do their homework. They can't apply for jobs if they have to apply online. It has huge consequences. So the end result, just to fast forward just on the broadband thing, is that after our series, the county set up a task force, a broadband authority, and after years of debate, they have now entered into an agreement where fiber optic is coming into the county. There are ways that it's being financed. We can't honestly say that because of our stories, this happened, but I firmly believe that we had a huge role in that. That's the power of journalism. Second, housing. We knew it was a problem, but there were a lot of people in the county who said, well, yeah, sure, it's a problem. It's an expensive place to live, but you know, I would like to live in a penthouse in the middle of Manhattan, but I can't do that. I can't afford it. So what's the big deal? Well, that's one way of looking at it. And in a pure construct of some economic viewpoint on that, that makes sense. But if you're a young couple and you want to raise your family in an area that is pretty and you value the environmental quality and you can't come close to affording a house, that is an issue. So how did we tackle that? We knew it was a big issue. We started talking to people, and then we did something really old school. We came up with one sheet of paper that had about 6 or 8 questions on it. Questions like, how much of your monthly income do you spend on housing? Have you tried to live in this county, but you can't find a place? I mean, all sorts of things like that. Are you in this income level? Are you man or woman? Are you single? Are you married? Do you have family? Do you have children? All that. And we started leaving these things at convenience stores, counters, at the food pantry where people come to get their food when they can't afford it, they need food assistance. We got an agreement from the schools to put these, to distribute them among teachers, because teachers very often could not afford to live in our county. They had to come in from elsewhere. And we ended up with about 128 responses to this, which again, may not seem a lot, but what we got out of that was a tremendous amount of information that we could then use to leverage our reporting. One of the things was we gave people the option, would you allow yourself to be called by a reporter? And a very high percentage of people said, sure. They put down their name, their contact information. So it's a form of crowdsourcing. I mean, you could really get it. So the end result was, I think, a 2 or 3 part series done by, I'm happy to say, an Ohio University graduate, Sarah Schoenhardt, who we brought on a freelance basis. And that has had a big impact in discussing now the problem in our county that we are exclusionary in many ways. And so that's the value of it. Okay, now, what's the downside of doing a professional survey like this. Hellishly expensive. We spent $43,000 on that survey, all right? And that's a lot of money. It was paid for by people in the community that we initially got to kick in the money. That's what good surveys cost. I have to tell you that many people in the community appreciated the survey. A lot of people did not. And this was so interesting to me. There were a number of people in the community that viewed us as outsiders. What are you doing? A lot of people thought we were sort of secret stalking horses for developers. We're trying to build a case to, to justify putting in trailer parks or, new apartment buildings or something like that. None of that is true. We were the subject of a lot of derision about, I can remember one big thread on a local listserv. Why are they wasting money this way? Now think about this. We're wasting our money. These are not tax dollars. We voluntarily put in money to do this, but people were outraged for doing it. And there was one guy, a former US congressman. This won't probably connect you at all, but there was a famous TV show here called The Dukes of Hazzard. Have you ever heard of this? It's about like Southern good old boys. You're American, right? You're not. Okay. Just wondering if you know the Dukes of Hazzard. Anyhow, it's about these Southern boys that run around in cars and crash into each other and they're drinking and all that. It's very popular. But one of the stars of this was a guy who ended up being elected to Congress. He's actually a very bright guy, but he ended up living in our county. He was outraged we did this. And so when we got done with the survey, we actually did a multi-part series about the survey. And we made sure that those people were reflected in their views of denigrating this survey. And this guy was quoted in our story as saying about the survey, he said, "We already know all this. There's a traditional rural culture here, and we've built a wonderfully attractive environment free of the overdevelopment and exurban blight of franchised living. Southern mountain people are very proud and are used to taking care of their own." And then he said, "It is idiotic to suggest that this community is not aware of its own problems." Okay, so that was a view that was fairly widely shared. A lot of people said, "You spent all this money and you told us what we already knew." It's not true. It did confirm a lot of the things that we suspected about the county. But here's the value of doing a really precise survey like that. First of all, we did not know the extent to which people viewed broadband and cell service as a huge issue. So that's one thing that told us. We didn't know the extent of concern about housing, especially among people who could not afford housing but wanted to live in the county, all right? When you look at surveys like this and get into the internals of it, you learn interesting things. We knew that environment was a big concern in our county, but then we broke it down in the survey. What about the environment is important to you? I would have never guessed that one of the big things was what we call night skies. Are you familiar with night skies? Night skies is, we're in an area that does not get the glare from urban areas of lighting that affects your ability to see the stars. I know some people may think, well, who gives a damn about that? But the fact is, people from around the country come to our county to be able to look at stars, and they value the beauty of looking up and seeing an unfettered environment. And I have to confess, it never affected me until I did a story years ago you all familiar with the Western Sahara Desert? One of the Western in Africa, right? Okay. There's a war that went on there. The indigenous people, known as the Polisario, fighting against the Moroccans. They want self-determination. So I spent about a month with them in the desert with the Polisario guerrillas. They're doing these attacks on Moroccan posts. But at night, you would sleep in the desert. There's not an urban glare from 500 miles away. And it is amazing what you can see. And I remember being there with these gorillas at night, looking up the number of satellites you can see. And I also remember an amusing thing, these people telling me through an interpreter that actually those satellites are the CIA looking at them. And what I really wanted to say is, actually, they don't care about you. You may think so, but they do not care about the Polisario in the middle of the Western Sahara Desert. But anyhow, night skies, in our case, turned out to be a huge issue. Second thing about the environment, I would have never guessed this. Second biggest concern, the quality of our rivers. We have a lot of rivers. People care about whether they're clean. We have an issue because it's a farming community with waste from cattle that are grazing right up against the rivers. And much to my surprise, I would have never guessed, people in the community that care about the environment are really sophisticated enough to know this is an issue, it's polluting us. And so those are two things internally that I would have never thought about. A third thing that we would have never guessed. People were concerned about the quality of our emergency volunteer rescue squads. They're all volunteer. We can't afford to have professional staff. But the survey, the details allowed us to say, well, what is it about that that concerns you? Again, people will surprise you how sophisticated they are. What they said is, it's the age of the people who are the volunteers, which is a big issue, I mean, we're an older county. I should have told you when I described our county, we are one of the oldest counties in the state of Virginia. Our median age is 50 years old. Well, that's old. So you have people going out to house fires and car crashes that are, I know some of these people, they're like close to 80, all right? Well, people pick up on that. And the survey told us things like that. It told us what percentage of people who responded to the survey expected to leave the county within 5 years and why. Okay, that's all this is informing us journalistically. So when we dug into that, why would you leave this wonderful county? In many cases, I have school children. I do not have faith in the school system here. It's not that people don't like the schools. I don't think it offers enough opportunities for my children. Okay, well, journalistically, that's telling us at Foothills Forum, we got to dig into that, and that led us to stories about how there is a shrinking number of young people going to the schools, and the question of, can you maintain your schools? Or do you have to suddenly bus people 30 miles to schools elsewhere? We found through the survey that 63% said they were happy with the quality of county services that were offered, but in one area, healthcare. And so it allowed us journalistically to focus on that. So basically, the point of all this is that we did something smart there. And now the question is, what do you do with that information? That was in 2015. We're thinking of doing it again. So your first question is, gosh, if it costs $43,000 in 2015, what will it cost now? The answer is $58,000. All right. Well, we don't have $58,000 to throw at that. But this is where you can get creative. We have thought, first of all, we've got 2 years until the 10th year anniversary. There's probably a great value in doing this in some form because because we did the first one, we have a benchmark of what the community thinks. It'd be very interesting to know now, have your attitudes changed about cell and broadband service, because we're now finally doing something about it. But you can be creative with things like this. One of the things we've thought about is, we don't want to pay the full amount, $58,000. And I think I'm going to have trouble getting funders to say, yeah, we'll pay for another survey like that. But we might be able to team up with other people and call it a community survey. We might be able to get other nonprofit organizations in our community that care about selected things and have them split the cost. We may be able to do it regionally. It may not be as sophisticated as this, but we may be able to get regional grants from foundations to do that. And we will try it. So that is the survey. I'm a great believer in it. I think it helped us. The main thing it did for us is, even though those people who ridiculed it what I often say to them is, if we had created our nonprofit and not done a survey and just on our own started saying, well, we think these are the important issues in the community, we would have been ridiculed for that. Who are you people to tell us on your own what you think are the important issues? So it really guided us. Yes.
What made the cost when you do a breakdown of the cost? How was it broken down to make it
Yeah, that's a darn good question.
Because we call it research in our country. I think it's the same thing, similar to what you're saying. But I think myself, when I'm doing what you're saying, I wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, no, if few people could. I think the cost is in personnel and expertise and advice. There's a lot of that. Now that begs the question of, if we do it again, do we have to pay for all that? And we've talked to this University of Virginia group saying, look, there's certain things we don't need to go through again. We may not need to go through a focus group again. Hiring people to come in and do focus groups, advertise the focus group, properly select the people for a focus group. You can't just say, hey, anybody come. You have to get a representational group from throughout the community, male, female, and all that. That adds up in the cost. I think the actual distribution of the mailings, the advertisements, probably that costs money. It does seem expensive though, but that's the cost of surveys. Do you do surveys here?
Well, that's for Survey Research Center,
Yeah.
but that's a budget cut from the previous administration, so we no longer have that. But when we did, there are universities that have research centers that provide relatively affordable survey research opportunities. The other thing to think about is there are many academics, like the study we talked about yesterday by Terry Finneman at Kansas, that faculty members have research agendas, and many may be willing to work on your research project in exchange for being able to use the findings as part of their research agenda. And they can help you get the funding. The most expensive thing, if labor is eliminated, if you're going to do the work and they're going to do the work and they're going to help you come up with a rigorous method and things like that, then the expense is really the printing and the postage, right? Because you're donating your time to, and it's extremely time consuming to do paper surveys because it's preparing them, getting them out, resending, getting the reminders. And then when they start coming in, it's the data entry because it's manual. Now you can have ways to streamline it so that you could do computer recognition or something like that, Scantron type stuff. But those forms are intimidating to people. Those fill in the little circles. And then of course, if they don't fill in the circles properly, you still have to, there's a lot of manual work involved. But if you're willing to put in the time and effort to do the data entry, your expenses are really going to be printing and postage.
Yeah.
And now for an academic, it may not be worth it their time to do a study of just one news outlet's audience. It might be worth their time to do it for 4 or 5 different ones, right? Now that obviously increases the costs of postage and everything, but if it's one common method that's applied in 3 or 4 different locations, that gives the academic a data set that's worthy of publication. And it gives you the information that you want. Now, if you want your information to be proprietary, which is it's my information, I'm not sharing it, then you're going to have to pay.
Yeah.
And I would say if you're going to hire an external agency to help with it, the best bet is to hire a sampling agency, an agency that can help you identify and locate the best sample of your population, because that's extraordinarily difficult. But if they can give you basically the names and addresses of people who would be, your sample, that's money well spent. Because that's the kind of thing that you have a hard time doing.
You just added, you reminded me of one of the costs was that the University of Virginia, which did this, they purchased from some company a list of names and addresses that are verifiable. It just cut the time of doing that. You're right about academic institutions. So when about a year ago, when I was talking to Corrine of the County Independent, Corrine, who's the publisher? Yeah. What is that? Her is the publisher anyhow. I remember telling her that this area is not like our area. Our area has money, all right? But you have something here that we don't have, which is a giant university. And this university is a big university with a lot of great people in it. And you can draw on that. You're absolutely right. There's some people that may be willing to do it partly as part of their academic research. I think as we tried to cut the costs, if we do this again, we've talked to them about, is there a combination of mailed surveys, and in areas now that have cell service, can we credibly do a hybrid, a mix of them too, and then come up with some correlation that says, yes, this is credible. It's very difficult to do. Phone surveys are harder to do now than they used to be. So we're playing around with it. We'll try, I think. Yes.
There was a scourge of unsolicited emails and databases being sold by corporates. So they came up with the POPIA Act that really restricts, a person's choice when it comes to revealing addresses, where they stay, and all that. So that's one thing that might hinder that kind of research in South Africa, which is becoming increasingly difficult to access people's information. In my case, I wanted to get databases of disability units across the country. It's a no-go. They don't even even schools, they don't reveal their past students, even if they're wallowing in communities without any socioeconomic plug-in. And you want to assist, but they don't give you that information.
So how do you try to get around that? That's a real big challenge, I know.
I actually wanted to ask as well, just for an opinion on what you think on using Google Forms, because we found a way around it. How we started building a database, because we do a lot of profiles. It was just with the people that we profile, which is more than 1,000 entrepreneurs and farmers. Of course, we asked them can we keep their contact details, and they said yes. So we've done something using Google Forms from just the people that we have interviewed. And even with our education publication, yes, a principal may not give us learners or parents, but as long as they show us some proof that they have distributed to a WhatsApp group which has like 200 parents, that's good enough for us, and it's good enough for the advertisers, because we are able to say, once you start consolidating that, for example, there's a group of super scientists that we work with. They have a database of 5,000, but they distribute. We just send to them, and then they give us proof. So we know that our circulation based on these WhatsApp groups, and then there are people who then do come to us directly, but there's no way that a school will give you learners or parents. There's a group of private schools. They send to 2,000 parents themselves, as long as we have the proof. But we started with our own, the people that we featured. Those are the people. Every now and then we update that.
I mean, that's a great idea. Panel research is, I mean, just about every company now is doing panel research. After you have an interaction with the company, you get the email, how did we do?
Right.
That's basically they're building a panel. Just by responding, they're adding you to the panel, because this is somebody who is a customer who is engaged enough to provide feedback. Most people who don't bother with the feedback, that becomes the problem though with the panel, is that the panel is that basically the participants are self-selecting their willingness to participate. So it can't be generalized. It's not representative of the whole population. So if you have a very targeted publication, like we've talked about, and we're going to talk about in week 3, like special niche publications that are aimed at very specific groups, farmers, healthcare workers, those types of things, panel research like that is extraordinarily valuable. And like Sandili said, it's pretty, if you're willing to commit the time and effort to building your panel, because that's a specific audience who is engaged with your publication, and you want that information. If you want to do like what Foothills Forum did, is get a sense of what the community wants and say, we have our assumptions, but we don't want to go with our assumptions, which most newspaper editors in America do. They assume they know what the community wants, and they don't. And if they actually do research, they're like very surprised about what the community cares about, right? Then the panel's not going to be very useful.
Yeah. You know, Bill has probably heard this quote before, but it's something that I've often thought is good to repeat in newsrooms. And it came from Walter Lippmann, who's a famous American columnist, but it's where all think alike, no one thinks much. And I've always thought about that in newsrooms, how many times we get together and we are all sort of repeating what we think because of our environment. And there are things going on around us we are totally clueless.
Of course, Lippmann also was the originator of the idea of the scientific method of journalism we talked about yesterday, which led to journalistic detachment. So I love Lippmann's work too, but there were some drawbacks. But that quote is.
But the quote applies to so much, and it particularly applies to lack of diversity in newsrooms. You know, so you had a question.
Yeah, actually, it was just a thought. So, yes, we've spoken about getting insight into the readers from a journalistic position, from an editorial position, from a reading position. So I just want to find out, how do you conduct such surveys, but for an intention of commercializing or assisting, like allowing data to assist you with sales pitch, to assist you with how you sell advertising for the newspapers, without actually infringing on, I don't know, the journalistic part of, I don't know. So it's just a question, because I think when you conduct a survey, you have got a kind of, not an agenda, but you have an end goal as to what you want to achieve, but it might not be 100% ironed out yet, but you want to find out a little bit more. But I want to find out from the commercial side, how do you conduct a survey like that for sales purposes?
So the quick answer for us is we don't, because we are not a commercial enterprise. However, one of the things I should have mentioned about this is that this survey is on our website in excruciating detail. When you go there, you will read not only sort of the tick-tock of how we created it, but what the questions were, what the responses were, the graphic representation of the responses, all this stuff. And so anyone in our community, any commercial enterprise, the newspaper or anything else, could have looked at that and probably taken that information and applied it to them. And we are fine with that. But for us, because we're a nonprofit and we're separate, we're independent from the paper, it was not relevant. One thing, this is not quite on the same point, but one thing we are pretty careful about is when I'm a big believer in newsletters. I am fascinated. You've probably never heard of Axios. Yeah, okay, Axios. So the company that I spent my career with, Cox Enterprises, at one point owned all these newspapers, and then, like many of them, just got rid of them all. But recently, they bought Axios for $525 million. Axios is a newsletter-driven news organization. And what I like about newsletters, specifically ours, the one that we put out, the free newsletter, is that I can tell how many people opened it every day. I can tell who opened it. I can tell what time of day they opened it. I can tell how deeply they read into the stories, how many of the stories they read, and all that. That is a measurement that you can't get with newspapers. I mean, you can do it online now, but it's very hard traditionally with newspapers. I'm mentioning this because there's a temptation with newsletters then to start adding people to your audience without their permission. And there are not necessarily laws against that, but we are very sensitive to that. We do not do it. We think it's a form of spamming people. So what it requires us to do is that when we have these street festivals things, we say, would you like to sign up? In other words, they have actually given consent. But I have to tell you, it's a long process. I mean, we may go to a streets festival and we may get 8 people to sign up, but we slowly add to it. But I love newsletters. I'm really sold on them. And so anyhow, I'm sorry, we're just a different entity. Yes.
I have another question. It's on fundraising.
Mhm.
Okay.
So how do you navigate editorial independence, especially you are funded by people in your community, and if you have to write a not so flattering story about them or their allegations, the crime or whatever. How have you ever had to deal with something like that?
We have, on occasion, written stories that funders didn't like. I don't think we've ever in our existence ever done an investigative story that really accused somebody of significant wrongdoing, but we have clearly written stories that funders say, you know, that's not a perspective that I particularly believe in. And I think it's just like a news organization dealing with advertisers. I think you just have to say, well, I'm sorry, if you have a problem with the accuracy of what we're writing, we'll deal with that. But if you don't, if you just don't like the fact that we wrote about it, I'm sorry. You know, you may lose funders that way, but I think the alternative is if you accede to their requests, you're done. I mean, credibility is everything. Content and credibility is everything. And you get a reputation. Word gets around if you stand up to people who try to force you to do that. But it's an age-old problem, isn't it?
Words also get around if you cave into people.
Yes, the word gets around. I mean, if you make an accommodation for one person, the next week somebody's going to come in and say, well, you did it for them, do it for us, and then you're done. You're done. So
Well, and for consistency, then you have to be consistent. That's
Yeah.
the main thing. So everything you do sets a precedent.
mhm. And again, it goes back to transparency in a way. You know, so for instance, this guy who I mentioned earlier, who's giving us all this money and we need to get his permission to use his name, he'll probably agree. Well, he's actually, my personal view is he's a very good man in the community. He has made a ton of money. He may be a billionaire, I don't know, but he's clearly worth 600 to 800 million. And he's reached a point in his life where he cares about the community and he's got gobs of money and his kids are all set. He's actually doing things in the community that are important. I'll give you one example. There is a farm in the community that is 7,200 acres. It is the largest privately owned farm in the eastern part of the United States. And the family that owned this.
Average farm in Appalachia is about.
Yeah. And the family that had owned this was very committed to sustainable farming. But about 5 years ago, they said, we want to sell it. Okay. The fear was that somebody would come in and say, well, I'll buy the whole thing and then I'll start putting houses and 25 acres here. But this man I'm referring to bought it, the whole thing. I think it cost him something like $30 million. And he publicly said, we're going to keep it the way it is. We care about the environment. We're into sustainable farming. He may be losing money on it. I don't know. So my point is, I think he's a good man. He's also investing in some housing in the villages to provide lower income housing. I personally think that's needed in our county. But there are people in the community that do not agree with that. And so we have written stories reflecting their opinions. And I know through the grapevine, he's not been happy about some of that, but I'm sorry, that's the deal. You know, we're going to write about it. We're going to make our judgments. I also think the beauty of people like that is if they disagree, they have the option now of stating their disagreement on social media. You know, I think that's that's a great thing about social media. For all the negatives, when I was ombudsman of the Washington Post, if you came to me with a complaint, there were several things that could happen. The first level is I investigate it. I see that it's a significant problem. I would write about it in my weekly column that was read by 3 or 4 million people and everybody in the industry. You don't want to be in that place, or you don't want to be the subject of that. The second tier down is I would investigate, it's not worth a column, but I had a blog, so I'll blog about it. You still don't want to be in that. But the vast majority of the things I would investigate, I would say, look, I'm not going to write a column about this. It's not going to go in the paper. But here is my opinion of how the newsroom screwed this up or whatever. And you, as a reader, can do with it whatever you want. And people would use that and go to social media and say, the ombudsman said this. I was totally happy with that. I mean, I think that is their right. Isn't that the essence of free speech? Everybody has their say. You stand up if you think you're aggrieved, or write a letter to the editor. The odds are you won't get it published. But so I think that's an avenue that is good for people in the modern era. So.
If I can just state up front, this is my mandate as a newsroom. I'm independent, I'm non-partisan, and I will do the right thing. I think that's important. If that's put up front, then there shouldn't be all the questions later. So you're sticking to your independence as a journalist and as a publication.
I really agree with that. And it's something I thought about just last week as I looked at our website, which needs to be updated. Again, we're all volunteers, so it's hard to do this, but we don't really have in a prominent place our commitment to transparency or our editorial policies. We do have a gift acceptance policy that's on the website that basically says that, but it should be more prominent, I think. And, another thing I'm a big believer in, and this is something I've really encouraged students to do. It started probably 8 or 10 years ago. Most news organizations have their ethics policy that they put someplace, or they will refer to an industry ethics policy, Society for Professional Journalists, whatever. But there's a new trend of personal ethics statements, where a reporter says in a paragraph or whatever, this is my personal commitment to ethics. And I have encouraged students when they're applying for jobs, send the cover letter, send your resume, but send a paragraph. It doesn't have to be more than 150 words. And it could be as simple as, I believe in truth. I believe in the independence of journalism. I'm committed to ethical behavior in my entire life. Think that what that message is it sends a message to a prospective employer, or if it's the audience of a news organization, they don't think we think about that at all. And I will tell you an anecdote that this happened, I will bet 100 times when I was ombudsman of the Washington Post. In addition to the 41,000 emails, I had a call-in line where you could call in and complain about something. And then I had an assistant that would transcribe these things. And at the end of the day, I would get a list of maybe 30 people that called in. And I would try to pick the ones that I thought deserved it. So I would call someone, let's say I'm calling someone in St. Louis. Yeah, I'm Andy Alexander, I'm the ombudsman. I got your complaint. You raised an interesting question. So I've got them on the phone. I say, I think the starting point is I'll check the Washington Post's ethics policy to see how this fits in there. 9 times out of 10, they would say, you have an ethics policy? All right, so think about that. Think where they're starting from. They think, like the woman using the F word that wants to screw people in print, they think somebody just tells us something and we stick it in the paper. I mean, we do a terrible job as an industry of explaining the extraordinary lengths we go to verify information. Not that we always get it right, but that we're also committed to correcting errors. So it's just a pet thing of mine. And I know from students who have applied with those personal ethics statements, how many of them heard back from employers. It makes you stand out. I think it's a good idea. So. All right, it's lunch. Good, thank you for sticking with me.
Who was presenting after lunch today? Chris and would you send me your PDFs?
Thank you very much. Thank you.